Would you please welcome our speakers tonight?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Kathleen, for the introduction to this panel. I think for those of you who have been to a number of our to the Perspectives Asia series, this is a very different tack that we've taken for this one. As Kathleen was describing, a lot of the conversations which we have in this series are really about Australia separate, looking out to its Asian neighbours. And so issues that are happening elsewhere, they're happening out there. And in many ways, this conversation about Asian Australia is definitely something which is located, it's a domestic conversation. It's something which happens within the, or it doesn't happen within the Australian consciousness. And so it's an opportunity for us to really consider those histories and networks and flows of capital and information and knowledge that happen within Australia's own borders, within its histories and within the ways that it chooses to imagine itself both in the past and also into the future. This panel discussion is also something which is very close to my heart. Regardless of what decade you may have grown up in, I think in the short presentation that I'm going to give, what I have been able to, what I've been thinking about is that these issues of Asian Australian representation go hand in hand with the broader issues of Australia's own, how it seeks to imagine itself. So how Australia relates to its own histories, how it responds to migration and changing demographics in Australia, and how Australia seeks to articulate its worldliness and a sense of place in the world. So with that, I'm going to actually start with a kind of a potted history. So, there have been Asia has been in the imagination of Asia has been in the imagination of Australia almost since its, at least since its colonisation. So within the first 30 years of the colony of Port Jackson, there were settlers from China, free settlers from China, who had made their home there. So in 1818, the first documented settler was a man called Max Saying. And he arrived in 1818, married a woman, and had a family. There is also likely to be settlers prior to this, but this is one of the first documented arrivals. The second thing is Port Jackson was considered as an alternate route to Canton. So it wasn't just an opportunity to relieve the burgeoning penal system in the UK, but it was seen as a way of connecting the empire to other trade opportunities. And so the imagination of Asia was pre-existing within the colony itself. And probably indentured labour, Chinese indentured labour in particular, was present in the first decades of the colony, if not in the Second Fleet. So we might consider that the conversation about Australia's relationship to Asia might be a contemporary thing, something that emerges out of the multicultural context from the 1980s on, or it might be considered to be a kind of economic driver right now. But there is a history that precedes these conversations. So if the history of the Chinese in Australia roughly coincides with the founding of the colony in Port Jackson, how does the popular imagination at this point reflect it? So I've got two slides here. We're fast forwarded to the 1880s, so the period before the Federation of Australia. And these are not fringe. I mean, they're quite confronting images, but then they're also not. They're images that aren't reproduced in fringe magazines. This is the bulletin. So this is the popular imagination of Asia at that time in the colony. And I think, so the second one, the second image is a kind of warning to Victoria, urging them to join the Federation. So issues of race, issues of migration are very much go hand in hand with the founding of the Australian nation state in 1901. So if we fast forward 100 years, we've had 2 world wars, major conflicts in the region, such as Vietnam, changing economic power bases, the decline of empire and the decolonization of certain parts of our immediate region. Where do we end up in the 1980s? We end up in a kind of the easing up of the White Australia policy and a new kind of multicultural Australia whose rhetoric is really around openness, friendliness, togetherness. And this is a very interesting 50-metre long scroll that's in the collection of the National Museum of Australia. Unfortunately, I don't have the date, but I think it's quite a recent document. And also I've actually kept the full credit line on here too, because I think there is something interesting about the kinds of relationships that we see within the ways in which we leverage our own multicultural histories in the face of different kind of economic relationships as they're happening in the region. So it's a gift of the Australia-China Friendship Society. And then this is, I suppose, another kind of image of the modern Australian openness. I tried to find the cheesiest picture that I could, but I think it really does represent something of this desire for openness and tolerance. So this is a really dry part of my presentation. These are statistics that have come from the ABS. This first set of statistics is quite old now, 2001, but it's from a paper that specifically looks at Asian-born Australians. So if you can imagine that these statistics have increased in this time. So, you know, Australia's Asian-born population reached 1 million in 1999, and that was 4 times the population from 20 years prior. It grew from 276,000 to over 1 million. These relatively large number of Asian-born people contribute to many aspects of Australian society. And Asia itself is also a varied and diverse construct, and so their interests are also varied. So the relaxation of the White Australia policy had made a big impact in this migration. Still, you know, and people enter through migration and humanitarian programs. So when you look at this, Asian-born settler arrivals outnumbered those born in Europe for the first time in 1984. The reason why I put that up, the reason why I wanted to discuss this is because if we are talking about popular culture, who is it that we imagine is the audience for popular culture, or who actually drives it? So I wanted to kind of introduce this idea that perhaps our understanding of what popular culture looks like is not necessarily in sync with the demographic profile of Australia. And that's in 2001. And where do they live? These are slightly more recent statistics from 2014. There's annual growth of migration to Australia, and it increases at a rate bigger than natural increases. 1 in every 4 Australian residents was born overseas. The UK is still an important part of this, but when you dig down, more than at least 49% of migrants come from what we would more broadly call Asia. And there are two things. One is that there are long existing communities of migrants, and that there are also new and emerging communities. I mean, I think that we all know this, but it is good to probably see these statistics on the screen as a kind of precursor to the kinds of conversations that we're having. One of the reasons why I wanted to show this is to illustrate that, you know, that the complaint that people like me and maybe the panel might have around the representation of Asia in Australia isn't a casual complaint. It's actually something which needs to be better addressed because it is embedded within, not only within our demography, but it's also embedded within our history. So, as Kathleen said, we have three eminent speakers, and I've provided this as a background for their presentations.
Okay. And we're actually very lucky to have quite a few members of the law family here tonight. And it felt very appropriate to show this as an opening to my contribution to this, because in a way, I sort of waited my entire career, and I've been working in film and TV for an embarrassingly long number of years, 28 years now, and I think the family law represents a kind of normalisation of Asian people and characters, and when we were making it, we always pitched it as this is a family. And oh yeah, they're all Chinese, and but this is the story of a family. And I think, I mean, I just want to start off by talking about why I think it's important for us to see, for people who are not from Anglo backgrounds to see themselves on screen. And I just want to talk about it in a more personal way, which is that, you know, when I was growing up, I migrated to Australia when I was 3. And grew, I was often, this was in the mid-60s, and I was often the only Asian person in my school, or, it was a very white time, and I grew up, watching, all the shows that we're familiar with, the Australian landscape we're all familiar with, and I don't need to say that it is predominantly, massively Caucasian, snow-blindingly Caucasian, and the effect that had on me, which is, I came from a migrant family, and we came to Australia to aspire aspirationally. We came because we wanted a better life. And my mother worked incredibly hard. She worked in Chinese restaurants and button factories, and we lived in housing commission areas, but she wanted us to have a better life. And so we were migrants, and migrants tend to be aspirational. And, the thing I've kind of learnt in my business is that, what we, particularly in television, film, is different. Because you have art house films that are kind of like dark and depressing, and I've made lots of them, and that you don't really want to aspire to. But television, television drama in particular, which is my predominant area, it was basically invented as a space between ads. It was kind of like that's the history of what TV drama actually was, and of course, what you want in the space between ads is aspiration, So as I, like in my early TV career, I was kind of pitching all these incredibly depressing ideas, and no one was buying them, and the word that you'd go around to different commissioners, and you'd kind of get, finally pick up on the catchwords, and the catchword for a lot of the 2000s, mid 2000s, when I moved into TV from documentary and feature films, was aspiration, because people basically, so you have migrants who want to aspire, and then you have broadcasters who want to make aspirational work. And what happens is that you grow up aspiring to be the person on the screen, and so you grow up aspiring to be white. It's never named. It's never like, well, I could name it, but at the time it was completely normalised. And for me, I felt all the, as a, my own piece of personal baggage, and I kind of was that I always felt less than. Like it was it was kind of over the back of my brain because like I was quite proud and I did well at school, but I always felt a bit lesser than. And so whenever you saw an Asian character on the screen, it was a minor victory. But usually they were drug dealers or prostitutes, and so that was not a minor victory. But like whenever you saw someone good, it was a major victory. For instance, when Michael Chang won the French Open, for instance, like that. Those things are really important, and at the same time, I didn't really want to identify as being Chinese either because it felt like a slightly shameful thing, and it was all very personal. And then I started making work about it, when I first left film school, and I kind of realised I wasn't alone in those feelings, and that there were a lot of other people in those feelings. And I made documentaries, like one of the early documentaries I made was about being gay and Chinese, and I kind of realised, this feeling that I had, because the gay world, like you think the Australian screens are white, you look in the gay world, it's like, makes neighbours look like the United Nations. The gay world is like so white. and I kind of realised when I met other people that we all had this feeling, which was that we just, you just have to work a little bit harder to be equal. And it's what women say all the time as well, that you just have to work a little bit harder to be equal. And so that's kind of why, for me, initially in my early career, I made stuff that was you do your personal stories, and it's always the beginning of your career, often the beginning of your career. And my personal stories just happened to be Chinese, and so I became the Chinese filmmaker. But later on, as I kept making stuff and kind of reflecting on my own history and why these things were important, I started feeling like, actually, it becomes more political. It actually becomes, it is really important for us to see ourselves on the screens, and it has a cost when we don't see ourselves on the screens as well. So I guess that's my, opening gambit. How long am I supposed to talk? Okay, I'll talk a little bit. I'll just say a little bit more, because the other thing that and I'll talk a little bit about the family law, and I started out as I've always been one of the few Asian filmmakers, and I just and I was certainly. There was a kind of, it's a very short lineage, and certainly the gay Asian filmmaker, like there was William Yang, who's a Queenslander, and then there was me, and now there's Benjamin Law. That's the history of 30 years. There are 3 people. That's kind of like it, really. But I think it's really important, because I think that the thing that will, bring change is that people are just telling their stories, and that's where authentic change comes from. And so when there are more, thank God we've got Michelle now, and we've got Corey Chen, and we've got more and more filmmakers who are coming up and saying that actually it's important to tell your story, and I think that's kind of I feel like we're at the beginning of a different period in talking about this sort of subject.
Well, let's come back to that at the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like all of our presentations are going to echo each other in terms of theme.
Okay.
I've got a little spiel here. Just in terms of, to give you some context as to why I do what I do and why I'm a writer. So I'm a writer who works across many different genres, so journalism, fiction, memoir, essays, screenwriting, theatre writing. And despite how varied my work is in terms of style and in terms of form, I always find myself returning to this overarching theme of my cultural background, of being Chinese Australian, no matter how hard I try to shake that. I've always found myself drawn to this idea of displacement and the outsider's journey of people who feel like they're occupying this sort of undefined middle space where they exist between several worlds and none of which ever really feel completely like home. So I grew up on the Sunshine Coast in the 90s, when it was still largely a monoculture belonging to folks with beach blonde hair, tan skin, broad Aussie accents. On the fringes were people like me and my family. You saw us before. bespectacled, lanky, black-haired Asian kids born to Chinese parents who, for some reason, chose to move from the metropolis of Hong Kong to coastal Queensland, despite the fact neither of them could actually swim. But, we still had the broad Aussie accents as well. And for a time, I think our difference was quite a novelty. It was seen as quite a quaint novelty. We were the exotic people who spoke in strange, interesting languages and served exotic, sticky foods at our Chinese restaurants. I was in primary school when Pauline Hanson and One Nation's rhetoric rolled in, and things took a palpably dark turn. So you flew here, we grew here was sort of the overriding sentiment at the time, despite its gross irony. People started pointing out my differences to me, whether it was kids at school sort of telling me that I had a flat nose like a wombat, or people yelling rice and China from their cars as they drove past. It's always from cars because they know you can't catch them. So One Nation really struck a chord in regional Queensland. Our neighbours had One Nation placards staked on their front lawn, so that was really a daily reminder that we weren't even welcome on our own street, despite the fact that all of my siblings and I were born a couple of suburbs away. So my sense of alienation came in stages. So first I felt unwelcome and in danger. Then I felt compelled to make myself invisible and try to assimilate, that aspiration to be white. And then I felt this really profound anger and resentment towards the fact I was made to feel this way. The lack of representation in the Australian media didn't help. There were some positive examples of Asian Australia in popular culture. The couple that I can name are people like Dr. Cindy Pan, Kwan Yeomans from Regurgitator, and Lee Lin Chin on SBS. But generally, representations of Asian Australians were negative or grossly stereotyped, or they simply didn't exist at all. For a long time, I actually wanted to be an actor, and I can't believe how common a story that is among Asian Australians in the arts who I meet. And they always throw that dream in for another creative role. And I really shot that idea down very prematurely as soon as I left high school, because I knew that I would never have work. I felt like my stories weren't valuable as other people's, and that above all, my face was one that people didn't want to see. As an Asian person in this country, I've often felt quite voiceless, which I find super sad. And I didn't come to this realization until in my final year of high school. There was this call out for memoir pieces for this anthology called Growing Up Asian in Australia, edited by Alice Pung. I think Tony's in it as well. So at the time, the book just sounded like an interesting project to me. It was something that I could sort of slot in between exams and studying because I was in my final year of high school. But when I started actually writing, I was really taken aback by how much I had to say and how cathartic articulating your own experience was and how angry I was, but above all, how deeply I sought that empathy and that understanding from others who felt the same way. And through that book, I'd been shown what was possible through representation of my culture in popular culture and in the arts, and I think after that I wanted to create that feeling of understanding for other people. I decided to become a writer because writing gave me ownership. It was the genesis of all stories, and so it enabled me to reclaim my own voice and some semblance of power. Since then, particularly as I get older and come to terms with who I am, I haven't been able to shake this desire to write about my cultural background. Duality and otherness is my lived reality, and as an artist, I find it really difficult to separate my experiences from my work. So throughout my career, I've written memoir essays about the joys and difficulties of coming from two different cultures. I've spoken about the intersectionality between gender and race in public addresses. I've poked fun at the fetishism of Asian women in my columns. I've worked on a show about my Asian Australian family for SBS. I've written a play about second-generation Chinese Australian siblings, and many more things in between that sort of comment on my Chinese Australian culture. And like I said, it's a narrative that I can't seem to shake, so I'm very much looking forward to unpacking it a little bit further in this panel. Thanks.
So since everyone's talking about origins, my great grandfather came here in the 1800s, and my grandfather was born in 1909. He's still alive. He's 107. He's amazing. He's got all his marbles. And he lives half between here and half between China. And so, you know, I mean, he's just an amazing man, and he's kind of fully embraced his Chinese side. But growing up, we were assimilating. My grandmother was making Yorkshire puddings, was making plum puddings, but we always had the duck at home, the juk at Christmas, but we still had the full-on Christmas fair. And so I think for a long time I was in denial of my Chinese heritage, and it's only kind of in the last probably, I don't know, 15, 20, that's making me sound really old, isn't it? 15 years, 10 years of my life that I've really kind of embraced it. And, you know, because I lived in England for a long time, I kind of disappeared, and my Chinese role models, the people who kind of tirelessly were telling those stories were Tony, they were Annette Chenoir, they were Debbie Lee, they were William Yang, but it was just a handful of people. And so every year I'd come back to Australia and I'd see more and more Chinese faces, but I wasn't seeing those people reflected on the screen. And it was the same where I was working as a producer-director in the UK for the BBC. There were three of us, three Chinese people. There was Paul Wong, Simon Chin and me. I'm like the only Chinese person I think that's ever worked as a director for the BBC. So, but I mean, again, that's only really struck me since I've come back, because I came back as a commissioning editor to work at the ABC, and suddenly I felt this incredible responsibility that I had to tell these stories of what the reflection of this nation was, and they were my stories too, because they were my family stories, but they were all Chinese people's stories, they were all Cambodian people's stories, they were Vietnamese people's stories. And so I went on a one-woman mission at the ABC, and I really had to fight hard to get those stories out there, and, you know, in that little space of the arts. So, you know, we started with William Yang, we put money into William's trilogy, My Generation, Friends of Dorothy, and I can't remember the other one, but one was about his family, and they're these beautiful kind of photo essays.
I think it was The North, was it The North?
Yes.
Was one of them?
Yeah. No, that was
before.
Tony's film.
That was before.
Which was a long time before.
That was 1999.
Yeah. And that was the film that Tony did with William.
Yeah.
And then I tried to get this thing up that was about East meets West, and I kept going to these meetings and saying, I've got this great idea. We do East meets West, and we have the kind of confluence of Chinese and Australian stories. And one was a story in China, and I put development money into that, and that didn't happen. But we did manage to do one which was called the Cambodian Space Project, which is this fabulous story, completely crazy. And, you know, I think at that stage they were thinking Mandy is completely nuts about this poor Cambodian girl who meets this Australian guy who's a musician. They get together, they revive all these amazing songs from the 60s, rock and roll Cambodian 60s, and but it also tells the dark story about how there was this beautiful culture that got destroyed by Pol Pot. And so I got one of 3 Asian stories that I wanted to do through. And then, you know, it's grown from there. There's 3 Asian people in my department. I'm the only department that's kind of really, apart from Sally Riley, who's kind of the Indigenous person who's now in drama. But, you know, there's an Indian Australian girl, there's myself, and there's another girl called Amber Ma, who's also Chinese Australian and has a really interesting history, and her brother's a performer. I'm trying to get him on the screen. I have to shamelessly admit that I got really excited when Aaron invited me here, because I was like, hey, I can check out Aaron, because I really want to do a series about Asian art, not just in Australia, but in China, Indonesia and Japan and India. And so maybe Aaron can present that, because I really don't want any of these white old men to do it. But it's kind of a process of trying to get people on screen, really having to fight for it. But it's also that thing of I really want to find directors from the Asian community, not just the Asian community, but Muslim directors, disabled directors, you know. And I think it's really interesting because only just recently the ABC formed a diversity panel for TV because of this problem of the lack of representation. And of course, the Asians come out of the woodwork, the few Asians that work at the ABC, you know, and we're all on the thing, but the guy who's the director is the white man who's the head of television. Because we're the people who want to see ourselves on the screen. And so for me, and it's fantastic that Tony is telling all these Asian stories, but he's still a kind of voice in the wilderness. And so, you know, I mean, we should be doing family law. We should be doing that on ABC.
You know, we pitched the family law to the ABC.
I know.
And you know why they turned it down? Because it was too much like Please Like Me.
What?
Oh, yeah, hello?
One of two gay men in the same.
But, you know, like, family law's not even about sexuality. You know, like, it's about a family. Like, it was too much like Please Like Me. And, you know, it's nothing at all like Please Like Me. You know.
But that makes me feel really ashamed, you know, that we didn't...
You should be.
We didn't... I'm not going to take all the responsibility.
No, you shouldn't be, but other people should be. Yeah.
So, you know, and I can see the change. You know, we recently we've commissioned a little book show called Bookish on ABC iView Arts Channel. That's presented by Jen Wong, who's a kind of stand-up comedian presenter. I can see us growing Jen and her taking on bigger roles. I'm talking to Ben about a show. I can't tell you about it yet, but you know.
I don't know about it.
No, I told him to be quiet about it, and he has. Very good. You know, Ando's on the ABC, and but it's getting those people, the makers. And what's fantastic about having someone like Michelle Guthrie there is that she's right at the very top of the ABC, and it's having people right at the top of that chain that go out there and say, I want the ABC to be a diverse place. And so everyone scurries around and goes, diversity, diversity. We've got to tick that box. And you know, I mean, it's not just about ticking a box. It's about getting Asian people in, getting Muslim people in, getting whoever is representative of this nation. You know, I found out the other day, I did a panel on disability, and the percentage of disabled people in this country is 18%. There's no way they're represented on our screens, you know. And so until we're telling all of those stories on our screens, when we can't say that this is Australia. We are looking at what we are in real life. And so that's why, you know, Tony's a national treasure to me because he was the guy out there. He's old enough to be. But he was the guy who started making these stories and kept going and has kept going, even though still I think we're in a situation where there's a lot of work to be done. And, you know, people like me who get into these roles of head of arts have a huge responsibility to not only bring in people behind the scenes, but to also represent people on our screens.
So when people are actually imagining what what popular culture looks like, what are they imagining then? I mean, because I've suggested that there's a disconnect between our demographics and what we see in the popular culture. So you said there is a responsibility for people like you to reflect it, but I mean, you're one person amongst many other people. So
But
what is it that other people see when they imagine popular culture?
Well, I think it's, I mean,
I actually
Sorry.
think that, you know, part of the issue has, and you know, like I sort of said at the end of what I was saying before, is I do think that we're in a changing time. But part of the issue is that, you know, so let's talk about specifically about TV, for instance. TV in Australia is dominated by network TV. Network TV tries to speak to as broad an audience as possible, and so whenever you come up with the story about you know, what's perceived as a marginal voice, you know, immediately that sets off alarm bells, because you know, we're used, you know, as, you know, Asian, Chinese people, we're used to looking up at, you know, watching, you know, Tom Cruise or Kate Blanchett and thinking, oh, I'm them, you know, like that, they're living my life for me. They're living this incredible adventure for me. We're used to doing that. And the people in networks and you know, commercial networks have to do with advertisers. They're scared that white people can't do the same thing. But it's just that I actually don't think that's the case, because, you know, Dami Kim, you know, like she's an example. You know, you had a whole bunch of white people, you know, barracking for a different coloured Australian. You know, the reality shows have got that. You know, people can imagine other faces, and I think that, you know, we're starting to recognise that. But I think there was a fear that you couldn't do that.
I think there's also a fear that those faces aren't going to get the ratings.
It's
and
all
so,
about ratings, yeah.
You know, we sit round a table and Family Law's gone out and it's like, hey, we're really surprised. This has done really well. We should have been doing this. Or Ando, you know, Ando has smashed it through the, you know, out of the park.
Yeah.
Those ratings are like the highest documentary ratings on TV this year. And, you know, people want to see that stuff. He is a really popular figure. He won Australian of the Year. But also he's an engaging person on TV. He's got a story to tell. You know, he's talking to people like Charlie Teo, and, you know, but he's talking to everybody. And I think there's this misconception. First of all, I think there's a whole lot of white guys running the show, or there has been, and of course they're going to want to see themselves reflected. And I think that is changing. But I also think people are frightened that if we put a few ethnic people on the screen, that the ratings are going to plummet.
Yeah, I think it is a kind of fear and conservative. Network TV is essentially conservative. But I think that, you know, even if you look at, you know, I mean, film is another thing again, and advertising and magazines and literature. Like, every art form has its own particularity. But, you know, the ones that we know about are a screen. And if you look at the way that's kind of breaking down now, you know, it's no longer, you know, with the streaming service coming in and with cable being so exciting, and it's actually no longer. Network TV is kind of dying. We all know it. You know, it's a long, slow death. But, you know, like if you actually look at the way that the numbers are going, like fewer and fewer people are watching network TV. You know, they're catching up.
I mean, that was one of the questions that I brought up in our pre-discussion via email, was that we are fixated, when we think about popular culture, we're fixated by things that we see on our TV, but in fact we're mostly occupied by things that are happening on our phones. So are we in fact looking in the wrong place, that maybe the screen is, TV and film is slow to, is undergoing a much slower revolution, when in fact there's a different sets of communities which exist online. Michelle, what do you think about that? I mean, I suppose that, you know, there is a connection between your work and these kind of social spaces.
Yeah, I think definitely for millennials, the internet is a huge space for sort of grassroots movements, and things like Tumblr. You get a lot of, you know, for example, a lot of young queer Australians finding a real community there and a real sense of understanding. And, you know, you see things like web series cropping up on YouTube or Vimeo that don't necessarily need funding from networks or any sort of government agency. You know, it's a lot cheaper and more accessible with the new technologies that we have. So I think that's exciting, and I wonder if that is part of this movement that we've seen in the last couple of years, this push towards diversity in a more mainstream context. Yeah.
And Mandy, does that have an impact, you think, on the kinds of programming that would happen in a place like the ABC? You know, what is the impact of social media and online?
Well, it's a source of storytelling.
Yeah.
You know, it's where new ideas come from, and it's where we need to be looking, and it's where we're going to find the talent of the future. And the millennials don't have as much of a problem as we've had with diversity. So, you know, that's really kind of very refreshing for me, because I feel like it's a brick wall that I've been hammering on for quite a long time. And younger people just don't seem to have as much of a problem with accepting different voices, different faces on their screens, whether they be little screens, big ones.
Broadcasters are picking up on, you know, what's happening as well. Like it's much more fluid interchange now. I think that because, you know, like all the comedy commissioners are looking at, you know, like even the studios are, you know, like they now look at actors' social media followings as part of the casting process. They have formulas for how, it's crazy, but, you know, like how many Twitter followers you have is actually really important in the terms of the, you know, I think it is a much more dynamic kind of thing, and I do think, you know, that those small, you know, the smaller groups, the kind of tribes, you know, they might be, you know, we might be relatively small in Australia, but when you aggregate it across the entire world, you know, that's a big number.
But it's also, you know, I mean, I would like to do a film about this Sri Lankan play that's being put on at the Belvoir Theatre, and to find the actors, they're having to go abroad. They're having to go to India, they're having to go to the UK. And, you know, there's a whole discussion about can Chinese actors play Sri Lankans? Or can, you know, I mean, we had this discussion at when Annette Chanois did that panel with Ben Law and I can't remember who else it was, but and it was Annette. You know, we were all debating whether, because white actors, white English people play, Americans play English people, Polish people, German people. In Versailles, the English are playing the French, you know. So why can't Asian actors play different Asian nationalities? I mean, what do you think?
Personally, I think they could play it, but they may not do it very convincingly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be my sort of thing. That, you know, because I always feel slightly like even when I was casting Home Song Stories, like I was, you know, the casting agent, you know, who just basically lumped all Asians together, and so it was like, you know, I was getting people from the Philippines, and I was just saying, no, you know, this is a Chinese story, so I want Chinese actors, you know, and I was really particular, like, you know, they had to be Cantonese speaking because they came from this, you know, like, and I was getting Vietnamese people, and you know, it depends on the maker, and so, I mean, stage is different because I think you know, you're already walking into a box, so you're already already in make believe, whereas if you're making a film or making TV drama, you've got to try to convince people that it's real. So I think that's the issue.
Yeah, that's an interesting point as well, because I'm having the same sorts of discussions because my play is going up next year at Le Bois, and it is about a Chinese-Australian family, and we've tried to find local actors, and we've had to cast the net wide to, you know, Sydney and Victoria, and they sort of put this question to me, you know, would you be all right with your Asian actors? And I sort of grappled with that for quite some time. And I think we sort of came to this conclusion that as long as most of the actors are Chinese-Australian. But then there is the point of, you know, it's a different medium. Theatre is a medium
I think they are different mediums,
you're already forced to be in this imagined space.
Yeah.
Whereas,
you're walking
TV,
into a room
it's
and
realism. It's different.
Yeah, exactly. So I would sort of say that would be my response, that maybe for a play you could do it, because, you know, you have grown-ups playing children all the time on you know, in theatre, but if you're doing it as a film or a TV show, then that would be harder.
I mean, my grandfather had another little career as an extra, and I remember he was cast as a Japanese businessman for Qantas, for a Qantas ad. And we were outraged. We were like, how could these idiots think that this guy was Japanese?
Yeah.
But he got the job. He said, I'll take the money, thanks very much. I don't have a problem with it. We had a problem with it.
Maybe this is a bit of a controversial point to make, but I sort of feel like, as we were talking about before, how as a minority viewer, you're forced to project yourself onto other people's stories that you're seeing on the screen. I feel like when you come from a minority, whether that is, a cultural background or your gender, you're used to projecting yourself onto the majority and whoever's in charge, whoever has power. And because you're living in that reality and that's all you know, it's easier for you to inhabit those voices, whereas when it's flipped, and say a white man was writing a character from my perspective as a young Chinese Australian woman, it doesn't work as strongly. It's more likely to come across as offensive or two-dimensional. And so I think when you come from an othered group and you are sort of crossing over into other othered worlds, you do have a sort of level of permission, I suppose, in that sense.
Well, you're just kind of used to pretending you're someone else.
Yeah, and
you grow up pretending you're someone else.
You go into a room, and I've spoken to a lot of people from different cultural backgrounds about this, but I'll go into a room and I might see, a friend of mine who's Muslim or a friend of mine who's Vietnamese, and you're immediately drawn to each other because it's like, oh, we're the others.
Yeah. It is that weird thing of growing up thinking of other, because when you were talking about how you identified yourself and you're being drawn to otherness, and it speaks absolutely of my entire sense of my the things that I was interested in. I was always interested in marginal stories. I was always interested in trying, and it was just a natural place for me to be. And I even wrote a play once called The Fat Boy, because I couldn't just keep doing stuff about gay Chinese people, so I just had so I just wrote about a fat guy, because he was also marginal, and but I completely got him. I was still, it was still someone who was on the edges looking in. And what's so interesting about society now is that everyone is marginal. We're finally realising it.
Well, we just had a quick peek at the Cindy Sherman show, so that was this idea of make-believe and over-determining things, and dressing up is kind of a interesting kind of pretext to some of this conversation. We lost a little bit of time because I fudged the technology. So I'm just wondering if there are any questions for our panelists from the audience. There has to be. Come on, Turun.
I was interested in this idea of seeing these Asian faces in popular TV, and so often now it's in this comedic roles and these very successful comedy series that have broad appeal, like A Family Law, and you see them coming out of the States and the UK as well. And I was interested in what you thought about the timing that these are now accepted to quite wide audiences. And I've always thought that when I was growing up, you just started to see these Asian faces as comedians, laughing at making fun of their own families. And of course, all families are funny, no matter what your cultural background is. But it seems to have kindly got to a stage where everyone's prepared to kind of laugh with these kids. But most of these kids tell these stories with the Australian accent or with the American accent because they have grown up within those cultures and they're drawing attention to the humour. So I just wondered on your thoughts of, why has it come to now that these shows become so popular and these comedians become so popular?
Well, my feeling is that it's something to do with that we've reached a kind of age of peak TV. We've reached an age where we've just, basically there are only 7 stories, aren't there? Or something, there aren't that many stories. People interact in certain ways, and the thing that if aspirational was the word of the 2000s, of the past 3 or 4 years, the word fresh. Have you heard that word? Whenever you're in a meeting, fresh has to be fresh. It's the stalest word, but in my business, in my business, it's the word du jour. And it's kind of indicative as well. Like aspirational was kind of about how can we appeal to the broadest number of people, and we make people kind of like beautiful. Basically, aspirational is like put beautiful white people on screen, and we'll all want to be them. Fresh is we want the point of difference now. You know, what's different on screen, because there's so much. So there are so many stories about beautiful white people. You know, like, you know, you can't keep doing them. And so what, you know, how can you, you know, you've got this story, how can you make it fresh? You know, you put it in another world. And so that's kind of, you know, I think that that's part of the uptake. And I also think that we have people like Michelle who are getting angry. I think that anger is actually a really important thing for us to talk about, because I think as Asians, we're not really very good at being angry.
I'm so angry all the time.
I love that.
But, you know, what about tenacity?
Yeah. I know, I think we're just very tenacious.
Not giving up
Yeah.
is a good
I mean, there's
quality.
also a good proportion of us are looking for other kinds of images. So 1 in 4 of us come from elsewhere. 49% of us are from migrant backgrounds. So, you know, maybe the audience is changing as well.
Yeah.
I think it is kind of changing, but what was really interesting was like, because I've sort of seen different waves of it. Like I remember when Clara Law made Floating Life, which is a beautiful, beautiful film about, you know, people migrating to Australia from Hong Kong, and the producer was a friend of mine, and she said she could not get Chinese people to watch that film. And you would think that was kind of like that, you know, like if you could get, you know, 6% of the Australian population to watch that film, you would have had a hit. And then with my film, Home Song Stories as well, you know, like there aren't that many Chinese Australian films, you know.
I mean, we're doing the story of Australian cinema at the moment, and you know, suddenly we were looking at these programs, going, where are the Asian films?
Yeah.
There's Clara, there's yours, and we better talk to. You know, we've got to have somebody in here from, you know, any kind of migrant background, because apart from those few films,
there's only
there's
4 or 5.
just nothing.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible realization to kind of to realize that we've got this we made the first feature film in the world, and yet we're still struggling to. I mean, on TV, I think it's getting better.
Yeah.
I think in the world of feature films, it's still really
it's shocking. But you know, I think that, you know, Asian people in particular, you know, I just make up a statistic because it sounds good, but I think we are the most underrepresented minority, don't you think?
Especially considering how long we've been here.
Yeah, and how many of them of us there are. You know, like I think we're really underrepresented. And like you try to think of an Asian leading man, not in a comedy, but just in a romantic lead on any TV show, any movie. Can you think of one? Can you think of anyone?
No. Going off of your point, Tony.
not in this country.
Yeah, that's
No,
right.
not in
Yeah.
this
Not in
country.
this
Like,
country.
yeah.
And answering your question, I think maybe also part of it is audiences want to see more and different vulnerability. I think when you're seeing stories that are coming from marginalised voices, you're sort of more in touch with the director's view is sort of more of an empathetic one. I was listening to this keynote by Jill Soloway, who was the showrunner for Transparent, and she was talking about the female gaze, and how the female gaze is all about seeing. As a director, it's seeing and then putting yourself in the body of the person that you're filming, and it's all about empathy, and it's all about feeling as opposed to being the object of the camera and gazing at someone else, which is, you know, the male gaze, as we all know. But I think, you know, there's also this shift and it's really happening really sort of more obviously in Hollywood, I suppose, with people like Constance Wu and George Takei sort of finally coming to speak out, and they all banded together after the whole, you know, Oscar so white controversy, and then there was the very odd then flip side of that was when they brought out Jewish and Asian children onto stage and sort of made light of the fact, made fun of them and the stereotype of them being accountants, and how ironic it was that there was this controversy surrounding Oscar So White and the underrepresentation of African American actors, and yet they were so flippant about this other aspect of underrepresentation in Hollywood. And I think there's this groundswell of anger and exhaustion that's finally hit this point. And I really feel that deeply as a creative in Australia. There always is that temptation to move overseas, but it's like if we all move overseas, then nothing's going to change.
I think anger is really important for us because I'm more at the exhaustion end. You can be the angry end, I'm at the exhaustion end. But I think it's really important because I think that we're model migrants. And I think that's, we're really good at fitting in. And, and I've spent my entire career trying to be liked. We don't protest enough and we don't get angry enough and we don't say fuck enough.
Yeah.
We just don't kind of... actually voice that we need to be seen. And I think that that's actually a real issue in terms of Asian representation, which is why, we're going to love each other sick tonight. Which is why it's so important that Mandy is doing the job that she's doing, because really, the thing that I kind of came to the conclusion a couple of years ago was that actually the reason that nothing, I spent all this time working in this industry and they talked about diversity at the beginning of my career when I left film school in 1989, that we were talking about then. And then I just watched it and nothing really changed. And it was because no one really cared. No one actually, the fact that there haven't even been statistics done until this year. Screen Australia didn't care and they were a government body. No one actually cared that much except for the occasional actor who got a lead role and did an interview and said, Australia's so white, and then 3 years later, another non-Anglo actor would get a lead role and do an interview and say Australia's so white, and then nothing would change. But it feels like the only way you change is by getting a bit angry, a bit loud, and vocalising that.
Yeah.
When I left today to come here, I left a kind of room full of executives, and I said, I'm off to do another panel about Asian Australians. So one day you won't have to do that, Mandy.
Yeah.
One day there'll be a load of other people to choose from.
Yeah, I know.
Or it's when you get invited to do a diversity panel and all of you all do very different, varied things, but you're asked to speak about your point of difference as opposed to your work.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's frustrating. I did that at the Brisbane Writers' Festival and we all had a good laugh.
Are there other questions? Yes, back there.
I think you have to hang in there, really. I think that, what was interesting, that I had a coffee a couple of days ago with a friend who's married to a Vietnamese actress who I know, and he was saying that it used to be that she would go to castings and we were talking about the way Australia's changing. She'd go to castings and she would be one of 6 Asian girls, all there to play the prostitute, or all there to play the heroin addict or whatever. And now she's going to castings, and there's an Indigenous woman, there are a couple of blonde women, and she's going for roles that are actually non-specific. And I think that there is a changing awareness and consciousness of it. Like, diversity is no longer a really uncool word; it's actually become a cool word. And I think that's so it's just hanging in there.
There's also
Just answer to that too. I don't know if you know about and
performance foray.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they have an Asian Australian directory that you can be part of. That people will.
So
Yeah.
casting
We can share that information after the session.
But I just want to acknowledge Anand Sharma's work
Yeah.
in this arena.
Who put us all together, actually.
Yeah, and she's doing amazing work in theatre and
Yeah, Parramatta.
and discovering new people. And I love going to her things because it's like, who can I find? Who's
And
next?
she
Who's the
has
next
been a
person?
lone voice in theatre for a long time now, you know.
And she got fed up with television, which is why she
Yeah.
went to theatre.
Yeah.
So, you know, but it's great having her there because she is tireless in what in what she does.
She cares about this, particularly about Asian representation, you know.
Well, and the work that she's doing now is what is putting, you know, the instigation of what Michelle's work, art theatre,
Yeah.
my work, who else can we mention?
So many people.
Yeah, so, and she had the workshops in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, so there will be all this groundswell of Asian Australia.
Yeah, she's a powerhouse.
I mean, Joel Ma's beautiful show In Between Two.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw that. It was really wonderful.
Okay, yes, just one last question.
I was really struck by all of you repeating about anger. So I'm really interested in if you were to create something that tried to articulate anger, what would that look like?
I like to use therapy, but no, I've done a couple of panels where people will sort of ask about what's the inspiration behind your work, and a lot of my inspiration is anger, because a lot of all of my work is incredibly political and it's all social commentary, and what I like to use as a carrier for that anger is comedy. Because when you get on your soapbox and you rant at people, they're not going to listen to you. But if you make them laugh and make them see the absurdity of the inequality that we see every day, they're just like, shit, that's real. Yeah, I think comedy, I think it's much harder to make someone laugh than it is to make them cry. And if you can do both, that's incredible. But I think when you can make someone laugh, it's easy to make them an ally.
I have very diverse tastes, surprise. I kind of like, you know, my work goes from kid shows to supernatural shows to, you know, the family law. I'm kind of lucky because I get to express those different. If I was going to do it, I actually worked on a mini-series once about the Chinese in Australia. So all those images and, you know, like I did a whole years and years of research. And it was called The Wives of Kwong, and it was about a Chinese businessman in the Northern Territory who has 3 wives, and that was always a dream project for me in terms of talking about, because it was kind of like basically it's a melodrama, but it was with all Chinese people set in the Northern Territory with kind of, you know, it was.
I was actually going to show that postcard. There's a series of postcards that were made probably about that family, as a kind of
William
freak
Yang,
show.
you know, basically it was commissioned by Penny Chapman when she was head of drama at the ABC. She was passionate. This was the mid-90s. Passionate about doing something about the Chinese in Australia, and she got William Yang to drive around Australia and do oral histories, and he came up with the most, like, that actual research would be a phenomenal body of work.
Well,
and he just went around talking to people.
It changed William's practice. He kind of describes it as he's coming out as a Chinese guy.
And so William and me and Nick Jose, who was a novelist who was the Chinese cultural attaché at one stage in Beijing, in Shanghai, I think.
No, in Beijing.
Oh, was it Beijing? Yeah. Anyway, it was hilarious because, you know, we'd go to Yamcha to do our meetings, and Nick was the only one who could speak Chinese. But you know, that's a project that I would be, you know, amazing to make. We could never quite get it financed.
I think for me, I'd like to commission a lot more things that reflect us in the Asia Pacific. And so when I say, you know, I'd love to do a series about Asian art because there's some fabulous Asian artists in this country, but also, you know, we looked at we're doing the APT that that happens in this gallery, that there's so much great art that comes in here, but we don't talk about it. We don't look at the influences that are all around us in all these Asian countries. It's time, and I'm leveraging the power of Michelle Guthrie to say, let me commission this. And that's you have to use everything you've got. Maybe before she came along, I wouldn't have been able to do a series like that, but now I know I could go to Michelle and say, hey, I really want to do this series, will you support me? I need a big budget for it, can you? And she would be behind it.
I mean, the thing that always gets to me is that Australia relies so much on China. China was the buffer for Australia not going down with the GFC. And, the mining boom was so much to do with China, but they're willing to take Chinese money, but they're not willing to put Chinese faces on screen.
Yeah.
But it's also that we don't know a lot about those places culturally, and so it's a perfect way of looking at beautiful art, but also telling the stories of the countries and the cultures around us, and how those cultures have had an influence on this country.
And with that, I think we come to the end of this little discussion. I'm sure we could go on and on.
I'm sure we could talk among ourselves for hours.
So if you could join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you,
Thanks, Aaron.
And I'd just like to also add my thanks to the panel. It was a fantastic discussion, and I thought it was really, really interesting just to think about that you're all talking about having those Asian positions to then be able to promote Asian content in all art forms, really. You're talking here specifically, but we do here at the gallery, as you said, Mandy, through the APT. But to remember that also other people, like you're saying, Nick Jose, do that too. And I do think that there is a real wave of interest, and it is for a whole lot of things. It is, as you were saying, Tony, from aspiration to the fresh. The fresh is here to stay, and how wonderful is that? Because we do have to find new content, and as you said, Mandy, that content comes from ideas and from everyone, so that I think we're going to see a lot more, and I feel really, really positive and optimistic that will happen, because people are genuinely interested. And it comes, I think, just to end, because I could talk forever too, but Michelle, your idea of vulnerability, I think, is a really important one. You talked about anger, but vulnerability was a word you mentioned. And I think in all of the stories, what links them together is the vulnerability, the human vulnerability. And that human vulnerability is what we all want to hear, and we all want to understand a bit more, whether it's from this culture or that culture, whether it's linked to political events or not. I think that idea of intimacy and vulnerability is hugely important. So I'm very confident that we'll see a lot more, and I'm absolutely delighted that you've spoken about it, and wish you all the very, very best in doing that. We will be trying to do our best job here as well from our little part. So thank you. Please join me again in thanking you.